In 1914, British colonizers drew a line on a map, forcing three distinct regions, hundreds of ethnic groups, and millions of people into a single nation called Nigeria. What followed was a ticking time bomb of ethnic tensions, political power struggles, and resource conflicts that would eventually explode into one of Africa's deadliest civil wars. But the story of the Nigerian Civil War isn't just about the 30 months of brutal fighting that claimed over 1 million lives. It's about how foreign powers played chess with African lives, how oil shaped international allegiances, and how the echoes of colonial decisions still reverberate today. This is the story of how artificial borders drawn by people who never set foot in Nigeria led to a war that would change the face of Africa forever. This is the story of how artificial borders drawn by people who never set foot in Nigeria led to a war that would change the face of Africa forever. We are about to talk about how the Nigeria Civil War wasn't just a battle over secession. But before we do, if you want to be entered in our video shoutout giveaway, simply subscribe, then comment "I subbed," and you will be entered. This video's shoutout giveaway goes to Adeyinka Prime. Thanks for being part of the familia and supporting. Now, let's get back to it. Competition for political and economic power exacerbated tensions. Nigeria gained independence from the United Kingdom on the 1st October 1960, with a population of 45.2 million made up of more than 300 differing ethnic and cultural groups. When the colony of Nigeria was created, its three largest ethnic groups were the Igbo, who formed about 60 to 70% of the population in the southeast, the Hausa Fulani of the Sokoto Caliphate, who formed about 67% of the population in the northern part of the territory, and the Yoruba, who formed about 75% of the population in the southwest. Although these groups have their homelands, by the 1960s, the people were dispersed across Nigeria, with all three ethnic groups represented substantially in major cities. When the war broke out in 1967, there were still 5,000 Igbos in Lagos. The semi-feudal and Muslim Hausa Fulani in the north were traditionally ruled by a conservative Islamic hierarchy consisting of emirs who in turn owed their ultimate allegiance to the Sultan of Sokoto, whom they regarded as the source of all political power and religious authority. Apart from the Hausa Fulani, the Kanuri were another dominant majority Muslim ethnic group that had key figures in the war. They made up about 5% of Nigeria's population and were the dominant ethnic group in the northeastern state. They historically successfully resisted the Sokoto Caliphate during the 19th century through their millennium-long Kanem Bornu Empire. The southernmost part of the region, known as the Middle Belt, had large populations of Christian and animist populations. Through missionary activities and the northernization policy of the regional government, the sub-region had a significant Eurocentric educated population. Several key figures on the Nigerian side of the war came from this sub-region, such as Yakubu Gowon and Theophilus Danjuma, both of whom were Christians. The Yoruba political system in the southwest, like that of the Hausa Fulani, also consisted of a series of monarchs, the Oba. The Yoruba monarchs, however, were less autocratic than those in the north. The political and social system of the Yoruba accordingly allowed for greater upward mobility based on acquired rather than inherited wealth and title. In contrast to the two other groups, Igbos and the ethnic groups of the Niger Delta in the southeast lived mostly in autonomous, democratically organized communities, although there were ezezes or monarchs in many of the ancient cities, such as the Kingdom of Anri. At its zenith, the kingdom controlled most of Igboland, including influence on the Anyoma people, Arochukwu, which controlled slavery in Igbo and Onitsha territory. Unlike the other two regions, decisions within the Igbo communities were made by a general assembly in which men and women participated. Considering this participation by women in this civil war, the study female fighters and the fates of rebellions. How mobilizing women influences conflict duration by Reed M. Wood observed that there was a longer duration of wars between rebel groups and the number of women that participated within the conflict at hand. In discussing the correlation between conflicts of longer duration and a high rate of participation of women, the study suggests that gender norms and the general ways in which an armed group recruits as well as who it recruits may subsequently influence its behaviors during the conflict and the manner in which the conflict unfolds. The differing political systems and structures reflected and produced divergent customs and values. The Hausa Fulani commoners, having contact with the political system only through a village head designated by the emir or one of his subordinates, did not view political leaders as amenable to influence. Political decisions were to be submitted to. As with many other authoritarian, religious and political systems, leadership positions were given to persons willing to be subservient and loyal to superiors. A chief function of this political system in this context was to maintain conservative values, which caused many Hausa Fulani to view economic and social innovation as subversive or sacrilegious. In contrast to the Hausa Fulani, the Igbos and other Biafrans often participated directly in the decisions which affected their lives. They had a lively awareness of the political system and regarded it as an instrument for achieving their personal goals. Status was acquired through the ability to arbitrate disputes that might arise in the village and through acquiring rather than inheriting wealth. The Igbo had been substantially victimized in the Atlantic slave trade. In the year 1790, it was reported that of 20,000 people sold each year from Bonny, 16,000 were Igbo. With their emphasis upon social achievement and political participation, the Igbo adapted to and challenged colonial rule in innovative ways. These tradition-derived differences were perpetuated and perhaps enhanced by the colonial government in Nigeria. In the north, the colonial government found it convenient to rule indirectly through the emirs, thus perpetuating rather than changing the indigenous authoritarian political system. Christian missionaries were excluded from the north, and the area thus remained virtually closed to European cultural influence. By contrast,
The richest of the Igbo often sent their sons to British universities with the intention of preparing them to work with the British. During the ensuing years, the northern emirs maintained their traditional political and religious institutions while reinforcing their social structure. At the time of independence in 1960, the North was by far the most underdeveloped area in Nigeria. It had an English literacy rate of 2% as compared to 19.2% in the East. Literacy in Ajami, local languages in Arabic script, learned in connection with religious education, was much higher. The West also enjoyed a much higher literacy level, as it was the first part of the country to have contact with Western education and established a free primary education program under the pre-independence Western regional government. In the West, the missionaries rapidly introduced Western forms of education. Consequently, the Yoruba were the first group in Nigeria to adopt Western bureaucratic social norms. They made up the first classes of African civil servants, doctors, lawyers, and other technicians and professionals.
Nigeria gained independence on 1 October 1960, and the First Republic came to be on 1 October 1963. The first Prime Minister of Nigeria, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, was a northerner and co-founder of the Northern People's Congress. He formed an alliance with the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons Party and its popular nationalist leader, Nnamdi Zik Azikiwe, who became Governor General and then President. The Yoruba Aligned Action Group, the third major party, played the opposition role. Workers became increasingly aggrieved by low wages and bad conditions, especially when they compared their lot to the lifestyles of politicians in Lagos. Most wage earners lived in the Lagos area, and many lived in overcrowded, dangerous housing. Labor activity, including strikes, intensified in 1963, culminating in a nationwide general strike in June 1964. Strikers disobeyed an ultimatum to return to work, and at one point were dispersed by riot police. Eventually, they did win wage increases. The strike included people from all ethnic groups. Retired Brigadier General H.M. Njoku later wrote that the general strike heavily exacerbated tensions between the army and ordinary civilians and put pressure on the army to take action against the government, which was widely perceived as corrupt. The 1964 elections, which involved heavy campaigning all year, brought ethnic and regional divisions into focus. Resentment of politicians ran high, and many campaigners feared for their safety while touring the country. The army was repeatedly deployed to thief division, killing hundreds and arresting thousands of thief people agitating for self-determination. Widespread reports of fraud tarnished the election's legitimacy. Westerners especially resented the political domination of the apparent domination of the political system by the North. and the chaos breaking out across the country motivated elements within the military to consider decisive action. In addition to Shell BP, the British reaped profits from mining and commerce. The British-owned United Africa Company alone controlled 41.3% of all Nigeria's foreign trade. At 516,000 barrels per day, Nigeria had become the 10th biggest oil exporter in the world. Though the Nigeria Regiment had fought for the United Kingdom in both the First and Second World Wars, the Army Nigeria inherited upon independence in 1960 was an internal security force designed and trained to assist the police in putting down challenges to authority rather than to fight a war. The Indian historian Pradeep Barua called the Nigerian army in 1960 a glorified police force, and even after independence, the Nigerian military retained the role it held under the British in the 1950s. The Nigerian army did not conduct field training and notably lacked heavy weapons. Before 1948, Nigerians were not allowed to hold officers' commissions, and only in 1948 were certain promising Nigerian recruits allowed to attend Sandhurst for officer training, while at the same time Nigerian NCOs were allowed to become officers if they completed a course in officer training at Mons Hall or Eton Hall in England. Despite the reforms, only an average of 2 Nigerians per year were awarded officers' commissions between 1948 to 55, and only 7 per year from 1955 to 1960. At the time of independence in 1960, of the 257 officers commanding the Nigeria Regiment, which became the Nigerian Army, only 57 were Nigerians. Military coups. On 15 January 1966, Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nziogu, Major Emmanuel Ifeajuna, and other junior army officers, mostly majors and captains, attempted a coup d'etat. The 2 major political leaders of the North, the Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, and the Premier of the Northern Region, Sir Ahmadu Bello, were killed by Major Nziogu. Also murdered was Bello's wife and officers of northern extraction. The president, Sir Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo, was on an extended vacation in the West Indies. He did not return until days after the coup. There was widespread suspicion that the Igbo coup plotters had tipped him and other Igbo leaders off regarding the pending coup. In addition to the killings of the northern political leaders, the premier of the Western region, Ladoke Akintola, and Yoruba senior military officers were also killed. This coup of the 5 majors has been described in some quarters as Nigeria's only revolutionary coup. This was the first coup in the short life of Nigeria's nascent second democracy. Claims of electoral fraud were one of the reasons given by the coup plotters. Besides killing much of Nigeria's elite, the coup also saw much of the leadership of the Nigerian Federal Army killed, with 7 officers holding the rank above colonel killed. Of the 7 officers killed, 4 were northerners, 2 were from the southeast, and 1 was from the Midwest. Only 1 was an Igbo. This coup was, however,
not seen as a revolutionary coup by other sections of Nigerians, especially in the northern and western sections, and by later revisionists of Nigerian coups. Some alleged, mostly from eastern part of Nigeria, that the majors sought to spring action group leader Obafemi Awolowo out of jail and make him head of the new government. Their intention was to dismantle the northern-dominated power structure, but their efforts to take power were unsuccessful. Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, an Igbo and loyalist head of the Nigerian army, suppressed coup operations in the south, and he was declared head of state on 16th January after the surrender of the majors. In the end, though, the majors were not in the position to embark on this political goal, while their 15th January coup succeeded in seizing political control in the north. It failed in the south, especially in the Lagos, Ibadan, Abeokuta military district, where loyalist troops led by Army Commander Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi succeeded in crushing the revolt. Apart from Ife Ajuna, who fled the country after the collapse of their coup, the other two January majors and the rest of the military officers involved in the revolt later surrendered to the loyalist high command and were subsequently detained as a federal investigation of the event began. Aguiyi Ironsi suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He abolished the regional confederated form of government and pursued unitary policies favored by the NCNC, having apparently been influenced by NCNC political philosophy. He, however, appointed Colonel Hassan Katsina, son of Katsina Emir Usman Nagogo, to govern the northern region, indicating some willingness to maintain cooperation with this bloc. He also preferentially released northern politicians from jail, enabling them to plan his forthcoming overthrow. Aguiyi Ironsi rejected a British offer of military support, but promised to protect British interests. Ironsi fatally did not bring the failed plotters to trial, as required by then military law and as advised by most northern and western officers. Rather, coup plotters were maintained in the military on full pay, and some were even promoted while awaiting trial. The coup, despite its failures, was seen by many as primarily benefiting the Igbo peoples, as the plotters received no repercussions for their actions and no significant Igbo political leaders were affected. While those that executed the coup were mostly northern, most of the known plotters were Igbo, and the military and political leadership of western and northern regions had been largely bloodily eliminated, while the eastern military political leadership was largely untouched. However, Ironsi, himself an Igbo, was thought to have made numerous attempts to please northerners. The other events that also fueled suspicions of a so-called Igbo conspiracy were the killing of northern leaders and the killing of the Brigadier General Ademulegun's pregnant wife by the coup executioners. Among the Igbo people, reaction to the coup was mixed. Despite the overwhelming contradictions of the coup being executed by mostly northern soldiers, such as John Atom Kpera, later military governor of Benue State, the killing of Igbo soldier Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Unegba by coup executioners, and Ironsi's termination
of an Igbo-led coup, the ease by which Ironsi stopped the coup led to suspicion that the Igbo coup plotters planned all along to pave the way for Ironsi to take the reins of power in Nigeria. Colonel Odumegu Ojukwu became military governor of the eastern region at this time. On 24th May 1966, the military government issued Unification Decree No. 34, which would have replaced the federation with a more centralized system. The Northern Bloc found this decree intolerable. In the face of provocation from the Eastern media, which repeatedly showed humiliating posters and cartoons of the slain Northern politicians on the nights of 29 July 1966, Northern soldiers at Abeokuta barracks mutinied, thus precipitating a counter-coup which had already been in the planning stages. Ironsi was on a visit to Ibadan during their mutiny, and there he was killed, along with his host, Adekunle Fajuyi. The counter-coup led to the installation of Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon as Supreme Commander of the Nigerian Armed Forces. Gowon was chosen as a compromise candidate. He was a northerner, a Christian from a minority tribe, and had a good reputation within the army. It seems that Gowon immediately faced not only a potential standoff with the East, but secession threats from the northern and even the western region. The counter-coup plotters had considered using the opportunity to withdraw from the Federation themselves. Ambassadors from the United Kingdom and the United States, however, urged Gowon to maintain control over the whole country. Gowon followed this plan, repealing the Unification Decree, announcing a return to the federal system. After the January coup, Igbos in the north were accused of taunting their hosts on the loss of their leaders. A popular example was Celestine Ukwu, a popular Igbo musician who released a song titled Ewu Neba Aqua, Goats Are Crying, apparently mocking the late Ahmadu Bello. These provocations were so pervasive that they warranted the promulgation of Decree 44 of 1966, banning them by the military government. The first president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was away during the first coup, noted, "Some Igbo elements who were domiciled in northern Nigeria taunted northerners by defaming their leaders through means of records or songs or pictures. They also published pamphlets and postcards which displayed a peculiar representation of certain northerners, living or dead, in a manner likely to provoke disaffection." From June through October 1966, pogroms in the north killed an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Igbo, half of them children, and caused more than 1 million to 2 million to flee to the eastern region. 29th of September 1966 became known as Black Thursday, as it was considered the worst day of the massacres. Ethnomusicologist Charles Keel, who was visiting Nigeria in 1966, recounted, "The pogroms I witnessed in Makurdi, Nigeria, late September 1966, were foreshadowed by months of intensive anti-Igbo and anti-Eastern conversations among Tiv, Idoma, Hausa, and other northerners resident in Makurdi, and, fitting a pattern replicated in city after city, the massacres
were led by the Nigerian army. Before, during, and after the slaughter, Colonel Gowon could be heard over the radio, issuing guarantees of safety to all Easterners, all citizens of Nigeria. But the intent of the soldiers, the only power that counts in Nigeria now or then, was painfully clear. After counting the disemboweled bodies along the Makurdi Road, I was escorted back to the city by soldiers who apologized for the stench and explained politely that they were doing me and the world a great favor by eliminating Igbos. Professor of History Maury Last, who was in Zaria City on the day after the first coup, describes his experience on that day. And the day after the coup, January 16, 1966, there was initially so much open relief on the ABU campus that it shocked me. It was only later, when I was living within Zaria City at Babandodo, that I encountered the anger at the way Igbo traders and journalists were mocking their Hausa fellow traders in Zaria's Sabot Gari over the death of their father, and were pushing aside various motor park workers elsewhere, telling the Hausa that the rules had now all changed, and it was the Hausa who were now the underlings in market or motor park. The federal military government also laid the groundwork for the economic blockade of the eastern region, which went into full effect in 1967. The deluge of refugees in eastern Nigeria created a difficult situation. Extensive negotiations took place between Ojukwu, representing eastern Nigeria, and Gowon, representing the Nigerian federal military government. In the Aburi Accord, finally signed at Aburi, Ghana, the parties agreed that a looser Nigerian federation would be implemented. Gowon delayed announcement of the agreement and eventually reneged. The proposed breakup of the East, West, and Northern regions following Gowon's military decree. On 27 May 1967, Gowon proclaimed the division of Nigeria into 12 states. This decree carved the eastern region in 3 parts: Southeastern State, River State, and East Central State. Now, the Igbos, concentrated in the East Central State, would lose control over most of the petroleum located in the other 2 areas. The federal military government immediately placed an embargo on all shipping to and from Biafra, but not on oil tankers. Biafra quickly moved to collect oil royalties from oil companies doing business within its borders. When Shell BP acquiesced to this request at the end of June, the federal government extended its blockade to include oil. The blockade, which most foreign actors accepted, played a decisive role in putting Biafra at a disadvantage from the beginning of the war. Although the very young nation had a chronic shortage of weapons to go to war, it was determined to defend itself. Although there was much sympathy in Europe and elsewhere, only 5 countries, Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, Zambia, and Haiti, officially recognized the new republic. The United Kingdom supplied heavy weapons and ammunition to the Nigerian side, officially to preserve the multi-ethnic country it had created, but also to preserve the supply of Nigerian oil to the United Kingdom and to protect the investments of Shell BP. The Biafra side received arms and ammunition from France, even though the French government denied sponsoring Biafra. An article in Paris Match of 20th November 1968 claimed that French arms were reaching Biafra through neighboring countries such as Gabon. The heavy supply of weapons by the United Kingdom was the biggest factor in determining the outcome of the war. Several peace accords were held, with the most notable one held at Aburi, Ghana, the Aburi Accord. There were different accounts of what took place in Aburi. Ojukwu accused the federal government of going back on their promises, while the federal government accused Ojukwu of distortion and half-truths. Ojukwu gained agreement to a confederation for Nigeria rather than a federation. He was warned by his advisors that Gowon did not understand the difference and would renege upon the agreement. When this happened, Ojukwu regarded it as both a failure by Gowon to keep to the spirit of the Aburi Agreement and a lack of integrity on the side of the Nigerian military government in the negotiations toward a united Nigeria. Gowon's advisors, to the contrary, felt that he had enacted as much as was politically feasible in fulfillment of the spirit of Aburi. The eastern region was very ill-equipped for war, outmanned and outgunned by the Nigerians, but had the advantages of fighting in their homeland,
support of most Easterners, determination, and use of limited resources. The United Kingdom, which still maintained the highest level of influence over Nigeria's highly valued oil industry through Shell BP, and the Soviet Union supported the Nigerian government, especially by military supplies. The Nigerian army in 1967 was completely unready for war. The Nigerian army had no training or experience of war. On the operational level, still being primarily an internal security force, most Nigerian officers were more concerned with their social lives than military training, spending a disproportionate amount of their time on partying, drinking, hunting, and playing games. Social status in the army was extremely important, and officers devoted an excessive amount of time to ensure their uniforms were always immaculate, while there was a competition to own the most expensive automobiles and homes. The killings and purges perpetuated during the two coups of 1966 had killed most of the Sandhurst graduates. By July 1966, all of the officers holding the rank above colonel had been either killed or discharged, while only 5 officers holding the rank of lieutenant colonel were still alive and on duty. Almost all of the junior officers had received their commissions after 1960, and most were heavily dependent on the more experienced NCOs to provide the necessary leadership. The same problems that afflicted the Federal Army also affected the Biafran Army, even more, whose officer corps was based around former Federal Igbo officers. The shortage of experienced officers was a major problem for the Biafran Army, made worse by a climate of paranoia and suspicion within Biafra, as Ojukwu believed that other former federal officers were plotting against him. Shortly after extending its blockade to include oil, the Nigerian government launched a police action to retake the secessionist territory. The war began in the early hours of 6 July 1967 when Nigerian federal troops advanced in 2 columns into Biafra. The Biafra strategy had succeeded. The federal government had started the war, and the East was defending itself. The Nigerian army offensive was through the north of Biafra, led by Colonel Mohammed Shua, and the local military units were formed as the 1st Infantry Division. The division was led mostly by northern officers. After facing unexpectedly fierce resistance and high casualties, the Western Nigerian column advanced on the town of Nsukka, which fell on 14 July, while the Eastern column made for Garkem, which was captured on 12 July. The Biafrans responded with an offensive of their own. On 9 August, Biafran forces crossed their western border and the Niger River into the mid-western state of Nigeria. Passing through the state capital of Benin City, the Biafrans advanced west until 21 August, when they were stopped at Ore in present-day Ondo State, 210 kilometers, 130 miles east of the Nigerian capital of Lagos. The Biafran attack was led by Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, Yoruba man, with the Biafran rank of brigadier. The attack met little resistance, and the mid-western state was easily taken over. This was due to the pre-secession arrangement that all soldiers should return to their regions to stop the spate of killings in which Igbo soldiers had been major victims. The Nigerian soldiers who were supposed to defend the mid-western state were mostly Igbo from that state, and while some were in touch with their Biafran counterparts, others resisted the invasion. General Gowon responded by asking Colonel Murtala Mohammed, who later became head of state in 1975, to form another division, the 2nd Infantry Division, to expel the Biafrans from the mid-western state, to defend the border of the western state, and to attack Biafra. At the same time, Gowon declared total war and announced the federal government would mobilize the entire population of Nigeria for the war effort. From the summer of 1967 to the spring of 1969, the federal army grew from a force of 7,000 to a force of 200,000 men, organized in 3 divisions. Biafra began the war with only 230 soldiers at Enugu, which grew to 2 battalions by August 1967, which soon were expanded into 2 brigades, the 51st and 52nd, which became the core of the Biafran army. By 1969, the Biafrans were to field 90,000 soldiers formed into 5 undermanned divisions, together with a number of independent units. As Nigerian forces retook the mid-western state, the Biafran military administrator declared it to be the Republic of Benin on 19 September, though it ceased to exist the next day. The present country of Benin, west of Nigeria, was still named Dahomey at that time. Although Benin City was retaken by the Nigerians on 22 September, the Biafrans succeeded in their primary objective by tying down as many Nigerian federal troops as they could. General Gowon also launched an offensive into Biafra south from the Niger Delta to the riverine area, using the bulk of the Lagos Garrison Command under Colonel Benjamin Adekunle, called the Black Scorpion, to form the 3rd Infantry Division, which was later renamed as the 3rd Marine Commando. As the war continued, the Nigerian army recruited amongst a wider area, including the Yoruba, Itsekiri, Urhobo, Edo, Ijao, etc. The command was divided into 2 brigades with 3 battalions each. The 1st Brigade advanced on the axis of the Ogugu, Ogunga, and Suka Road, while the 2nd Brigade advanced on the axis of the Gakem, Obudu, Ogoja Road. By 10th July 1967, the 1st Brigade had conquered all its assigned territories. By 12 July, the 2nd Brigade had captured Gakem, Ogudu, and Ogoja. To assist Nigeria, Egypt sent 6 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers flown by Egyptian air crews. The habit of the Egyptians to bomb Red Cross hospitals together with schools, hospitals, and marketplaces did much to earn Biafra international sympathy. Enugu became the hub of secession and rebellion, and the Nigerian government believed that once Enugu was captured, the drive for secession would end. The plans to conquer Enugu began on 12th of September 1967. On 4 October, the Nigerian 1st Division captured Enugu. Ojukwu was asleep in the Biafran State House when the federal troops attacked and narrowly escaped by disguising himself as a servant. Many Nigerians hoped that Enugu's capture would convince the Igbos' traditional elite to end their support for secession, even if Ojukwu did not follow them. This did not occur. Ojukwu relocated his government without difficulty to Umuahia, a city positioned deep within traditional Igbo territory. The fall of Enugu contributed to a brief destabilization of Biafran propaganda efforts as the forced relocation of personnel left the Ministry of Information disorganized, and the federal forces' success undermined previous Biafran assertions that the Nigerian state could not withstand a protracted war. On 23 October, the Biafran official radio declared in a broadcast that Ojukwu promised to continue resisting the federal government, and that he attributed the loss of Enugu to subversive actions. Nigerian soldiers under Murtala Mohammed carried out a mass killing of 700 civilians when they captured Asaba on the river Niger. The Nigerians were repulsed 3 times as they attempted to cross the river Niger during October, resulting in the loss of thousands of troops, dozens of tanks, and equipment. The first attempt by the 2nd Infantry Division on the 12th October to cross the Niger from the town of Asaba to the Biafran city of Onitsha cost the Nigerian Federal Army over 5,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Operation Tiger Claw, 17th to 20 October 1967, was a military conflict between Nigerian and Biafran military forces. On 17th October 1967, Nigerians invaded Calabar, led by the Black Scorpion, Benjamin Adekunle, while the Biafrans were led by Colonel Ogbu Ogi, who was responsible for controlling the area between Calabar and Opobo, and Lynn Garrison, a foreign mercenary. The Biafrans came under immediate fire from the water and the air.
For the next 2 days, Biafran stations and military supplies
were bombarded by the Nigerian Air Force. That same day, Lynn garrison reached Calabar, but came under immediate fire by federal troops. By 28 October, garrison's forces withdrew from the battle, while Colonel Oji officially surrendered to General Adekunle on 19 May 1968. Port Harcourt was captured. With the capture of Enugu, Bonny, Calabar, and Port Harcourt, the outside world was left in no doubt of the federal supremacy in the war. Biafran propaganda always blamed military defeats on saboteurs within the ranks of the Biafran officer, and both officers and the other ranks were encouraged to denounce suspected saboteurs. Throughout the war, Biafran officers were far more likely to be executed by their own side than by the federal army, as Ojukwu conducted purges and had officers who were merely accused of being saboteurs taken out and shot. Ojukwu did not trust the majority of the former federal Igbo officers who had rallied to Biafra and saw them as potential rivals, thus leading to murderous purges that led to most of them being executed. Furthermore, Ojukwu needed scapegoats, for Biafra's defeats and death was the usual punishment for Biafran officers who lost a battle. Out of a fear of a coup, Ojukwu created several units such as the S Brigade, commanded by himself, and the 4th Commando Brigade, commanded by the German mercenary Rolf Steiner, that existed outside of the regular chain of command. Barua wrote that Ojukwu's leadership, especially his frequent executions of his own officers, had a disastrous impact on the morale of the Biafran officer corps. The executions of officers also made it difficult for the Biafran officers to acquire the necessary experience to conduct military operations successfully, as Barua noted. The Biafran army lacked both the continuity and cohesion to learn from the war. Control over petroleum in the Niger Delta was a paramount military objective during the war. Oil exploration in Nigeria was pioneered by the Shell BP Petroleum Development Company in 1937. In a bid to control the oil in the eastern region, the federal government placed a shipping embargo on the territory. This embargo did not include oil tankers. The leadership of Biafra wrote to Shell BP demanding royalties for the oil that was being explored in their region. After much deliberation, Shell BP decided to pay Biafra the sum of £250,000. The news of this payment reached the federal government, which immediately extended the shipping embargo to oil tankers. The Nigerian government also made it clear to Shell BP that it expected the company to pay all outstanding oil royalties immediately. With the stalling on the payment for Biafra, the government instructed Shell BP to stop operations in Biafra and took over from the company. Towards the end of July 1967, Nigerian federal troops and Marines captured Bonny Island in the Niger Delta, thereby taking control of vital Shell BP facilities. Operations began again in May 1968, when Nigeria captured Port Harcourt. Its facilities had been damaged and needed repair. Oil production and export continued, but at a lower level. The completion in 1969 of a new terminal
at Forçados brought production up from 152,000 barrels a day in 1958 to 540,000 barrels per day in 1969. In 1970, this figure doubled to 1.08 million barrels a day. The royalties enabled Nigeria to buy more weapons, hire mercenaries, etc. Biafra proved unable to compete on this economic level. International involvement. United Kingdom. The UK prioritized access to cheap, high-quality oil from Nigeria. When the war broke out in 1967, it disrupted oil supplies from the Middle East, increasing Nigeria's strategic importance. Initially adopting a cautious wait-and-see approach, the UK ultimately backed the federal government, fearing the loss of oil concessions if Biafra succeeded. British companies like Shell BP sided with Nigeria, advancing funds to the federal government and facilitating arms purchases. Prime Minister Harold Wilson later authorized military aid, while the BBC supported federal interests through favorable reporting. France supported Biafra diplomatically and militarily, citing allegations of genocide. It supplied arms, mercenaries, and equipment, often routed through allied African nations like Ivory Coast and Gabon. France's geopolitical strategy, competing with British influence in West Africa and oil interests in eastern Nigeria, drove its involvement. Despite an official arms embargo, covert shipments continued under humanitarian pretenses. Soviet Union. The USSR strongly backed Nigeria, providing aircraft, weapons, and technical support. Despite initial Nigerian distrust, Soviet diplomacy secured arms deals, including MiG-17 fighter jets flown by Egyptian pilots. This support deepened Soviet-Nigerian relations and pressured the UK to increase its arms supply to maintain influence. United States. The US remained officially neutral, but aligned strategically with Nigeria due to investments and ties with Lagos. Public sentiment favored Biafra, but fears of antagonizing Nigeria and other African nations, coupled with the Vietnam War, constrained US action. President Nixon supported humanitarian aid, but avoided direct involvement. China supported Biafra as a counterbalance to Soviet backing of Nigeria. Arms shipments were routed through Tanzania, although this support remained limited in scope. Rest of Africa. African nations largely supported Nigeria, emphasizing non-interference in internal affairs. Tanzania and Zambia were notable exceptions, recognizing Biafra diplomatically. Neighboring countries like Gabon and Ivory Coast facilitated French support for Biafra. Egypt, on the other hand, supplied pilots and weaponry to Nigeria, although indiscriminate bombing by Egyptian pilots initially hurt Nigeria's public image. Mercenaries played significant roles on both sides of the conflict. Nigeria employed European and Egyptian pilots to bolster its air force, while Biafra relied on French and Portuguese mercenaries for training and combat. These foreign fighters provided critical expertise, but also highlighted the limitations of both sides' military capacities. After the war, Philip F. Young,
the chief of the Biafran General Staff, was asked by a journalist about the impact of the mercenaries on the war. His reply was, "They had not helped. It would have made no difference if not a single one of them came to work for the secessionist forces." Rolf Steiner stayed the longest. He was more of a bad influence than anything else. We were happy to get rid of him. A makeshift airport in Calabar, Nigeria, where relief efforts to aid famine victims were deployed by helicopter teams from 1968 onward. The war fell into a form of stalemate, with Nigerian forces unable to make significant advances into the remaining areas under Biafran control due to stiff resistance and major defeats in Abagana, Arochukwu, Oguta, Umuahia, Operation OAU, One, Ikot, Ekpene, etc. But another Nigerian offensive from April to June 1968 began to close the ring around the Biafrans, with further advances on the two northern fronts and the capture of Port Harcourt on 19th May 1968. The blockade of the surrounded Biafrans led to a humanitarian disaster when it emerged that there was widespread civilian hunger and starvation in the besieged Igbo areas. The Biafran government reported that Nigeria was using hunger and genocide to win the war and sought aid from the outside world. Private groups in the US, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, responded. No one was ever held responsible for these killings. In September 1968, the Federal Army planned what Gowon described as the final offensive. Initially, the final offensive was neutralized by Biafran troops by the end of the year, after several Nigerian troops were routed in Biafran ambushes. In the latter stages, a southern federal military government offensive managed to break through. However, in 1969, the Biafrans launched several offensives against the Nigerians in their attempts to keep the Nigerians off balance, starting in March, when the 14th Division of the Biafran Army recaptured Owerri and moved towards Port Harcourt, but were halted just north of the city. In May 1969, Biafran commandos recaptured oil wells in Kwale. In July 1969, Biafran forces launched a major land offensive supported by foreign mercenary pilots, continuing to fly in food, medical supplies, and weapons. Most notable of the mercenaries was Swedish Count Carl Gustav von Rosen, who led air attacks with 5 Malmö MFI-9 Minicoin small piston-engined aircraft armed with rocket pods and machine guns. His Biafran Air Force consisted of 3 Swedes, von Rosen, Gunnar Haglund, and Martin Lang. The other 2 pilots were Biafrans, Willie Murray Bruce and Augustus Opke. From 22 May to 8 July 1969, von Rosen's small force attacked Nigerian military airfields in Port Harcourt, Enugu, Benin City, and Ughelli, destroying or damaging a number of Nigerian Air Force jets used to attack relief flights, including a few MiG-17s and 3 of Nigeria's 6 Ilyushin Il-28 bombers that were used to bomb Biafran villages and farms on a daily basis. Although the Biafran offensives of 1969 were a tactical success, the Nigerians soon recovered. The Biafran air attacks did disrupt the combat operations of the Nigerian Air Force, but only for a few months. In response to the Nigerian government using foreigners to lead some advances, the Biafran government also began hiring foreign mercenaries to extend the war. Only German-born Rolf Steiner, a lieutenant colonel with the 4th Commandos, and Major Taffy Williams, a Welshman, would remain for the duration. Nigeria deployed foreign aircraft in the form of Soviet MiG-17 and Il-28 bombers. In May 1969, a company of Biafran commandos raided an oil field in Kwale and killed 11 Saipem workers and Agip technicians. They captured 3 Europeans unhurt, and then, at a nearby Okpai field development, Biafran commandos surrounded and captured 15 more expatriate personnel. The captives included 14 Italians, 3 West Germans, and 1 Lebanese. It was claimed that the foreigners were captured fighting alongside Nigerians against Biafran troops, and that they assisted Nigerians in constructing roads to aid them in their operations against Biafra. They were tried by a Biafran court and sentenced to death. This incident caused an international uproar. In the month that followed Pope Paul VI, the governments of Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America mounted concerted pressure on Biafra. On 4 June 1969, after receiving a personal direct mail from the Pope, Ojukwu pardoned the foreigners. They were released to the special envoys sent by the governments of Ivory Coast and Gabon, and left Biafra. New Nigerian newspaper, page 7 January 1970. End of the Nigerian Civil War with Biafra. Owerri is now captured. Ojukwu flees his enclave. Photographs of the military: Obasanjo, Jallo, Bisalo, Gowon. With increased British support, the Nigerian Federal Forces launched their final offensive against the Biafrans once again on 23 December 1969, with a major thrust by the 3rd Marine Commando Division. The division was commanded by Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, who later became president twice, which succeeded in splitting the Biafran enclave into 2 by the end of the year. The final Nigerian offensive, named Operation Tailwind, was launched on 7 January 1970, with the 3rd Marine Commando Division attacking and supported by the 1st Infantry Division to the north and the 2nd Infantry Division to the south. The Biafran towns of Owerri fell on 9 January and Uli on 11 January. Only a few days earlier, Ojukwu fled into exile by plane to the Ivory Coast, leaving his deputy, Philip Effiong, to handle the details of the surrender to General Yakubu Gowon of the Federal Army on the 13th January 1970. The surrender paper was signed on 14th January 1970 in Lagos, and thus came the end of the Civil War and renunciation of secession. Fighting ended a few days later, with the Nigerian forces advancing into the remaining Biafran-held territories, which was met with little resistance. After the war, Gowon said, "The tragic chapter of violence is just ended. We are at the dawn of national reconciliation. Once again, we have an opportunity to build a new nation. My dear compatriots, we must pay homage to the fallen, to the heroes who have made the supreme sacrifice that we may be able to build a nation great in justice, fair trade, and industry.
We've only scratched the surface of this complex and heart-wrenching chapter in Nigeria's history. If you found this video insightful, hit the like button and share it with others who need to know this story. Subscribe for more deep dives into untold histories, and let's continue uncovering the truths that shape our world.